Howdy, folks. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, Katie and I get to do a book review episode. It's been a while since we've done one of these, and we've noticed that in the question submission area of our website, some of you have been asking for this, and so we want to do it. We want to answer that question as to what we've been reading. It's been a little different over the last couple of quarters than the previous quarters, so we're excited to share with you how that's different. For those of you that enjoy this podcast, we would love it if you're able to leave a rating or a review on iTunes or Spotify or on any platform that you listen on. And if you watch us on YouTube, we would love it if you're able to leave if you're able to hit the like button or subscribe to our channel. That helps our podcast reach more people. So with that said, we will now get this episode started.
The Now That We're a Family podcast.
So the book reading reviews are never our most popular episodes, but they are some of our most fun episodes. And so it made our hearts very happy when we saw questions coming that you guys wanted to hear what we were reading, because we didn't want to force it upon you. But there are enough of you that care that we're excited to be doing this. And I would say this has been the quarter of December, January, February, right? That's kind of when we've read these books.
Yes, I'm not counting March.
No.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yep.
So it's been about 3 months. And yeah, do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
Sure. Maybe I'll get a couple out that I did back in December and then into January, I believe. And they were the book club books. And that was Lord of the Rings. So right now, I actually couldn't find my copy of Fellowship of the Ring. So I've got the copy of The Two Towers because that's currently what we're going through. But we read The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. And that was the first time I've read it. Okay. This might surprise some of you folks, but I've not read The Lord of the Rings. And I was blown away with how much I enjoyed it. That was the last month that we were in the tent that I was reading The Fellowship of the Ring. And it just has cemented in my mind like the coziest / most adventurous season of my life. And I couldn't think of a better book to pair with that season that we were living. During that last month, really, November into December, which is when I was reading this, we were lighting our wood. Well, I guess the wood stove was going all day, but, I was stoking up the wood stove every night. The kids were drifting off to sleep. I had the rocking chair in front of the wood fireplace or the wood stove. And I'd pull out The Fellowship of the Ring, and it was just such a cozy, adventurous companion throughout that season. Not that your companionship wasn't cozy and adventurous enough, because it certainly was.
Over theirs.
Yeah.
It's true. I was so glad you enjoyed that book.
Yeah, it was just so much fun, and so I read that like November, December, and then the other one I was going to say too, just while I'm at it, or should I just stop there and then you can go?
I don't know. We could do one at a time.
Okay, we'll go one at a time. So
if you want, you can lump them together. I don't care.
No, I'll do that. So November, December, The Fellowship of the Ring. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm so glad that was the last book I read while in the tent, because I will say this, okay, just speaking of the tent, I feel like the book club books were so perfect for that, because during the summer I was reading the Alexander Dumas, like not Lord of the Rings, Three Musketeers, kind of that whole universe. There's so many books. I was going to say trilogy, but there's like 8 books or something. So we read, the Three Musketeers 20 years after, and then is it the Comte Le Bregadon, or how do you say that? Comte Le?
Oh, I'm not going to try.
Anyways, so we read 3 of those Alexander Dumas books while we were in the tent, and those were perfect for those summer months. They were so adventurous. And then I went into Fellowship of the Ring. So really grateful with how I read during the tent days.
Okay, so the last book I read in the tent in December was that, again, I don't have it. All our books in the tent came to a tragic ending, so we do not have the books from the tent. I read, though, what is that one? It's the guy, the picture is the guy with no head, It's that dystopian book.
Oh, yeah. Brave New World.
Brave New World. So you read that as a book club book,
Yes.
right? So Elisha read that sometime in the summer, fall, and he recommended it to me. And because we talked a lot about the book and his takeaways. And I tell you what, I'm going to let Elisha read his book club books and just tell me about them and talk about the takeaways. I haven't read quite a few of them because they're just like, I don't know. I don't think I'd love them. I couldn't handle them. But this book was very disturbing, like very, very disturbing. I don't usually like to read dystopian books. I feel like I read them because other people talk about them, like 1984 or I do love Animal Farm. But this one was just, very disturbing. So I can't say like I recommend it, but it was interesting. What's interesting is that I feel like we are at this stage that the writer was talking about currently. And, we have with IVF, we have babies being made in labs. Babies are actually being made in labs. And with Soma or Doma, is it Doma or Soma?
Soma, yeah.
Soma, the drug that these people take to pacify themselves, to not feel too many highs or too many lows, I feel like it's technology in our current system. Yeah, we have drugs and we have uppers and lowers and we have so many things like that. But I think what that is like the universal drug is technology. And so anyways, it's fascinating because I think a lot of people, a lot of Christians maybe read a dystopian book and think we're getting closer to the end of the world. Like, see, it's coming true. But what I see when I read a dystopian book that was written 100 years ago is, see, this has always been happening. Humans have always had the same traits and the same tendencies and the same issues humanity has. And they just manifest different ways in different generations. And so to me, it's very comforting to see that there's nothing new under the sun. And authors were concerned about these things 100 years ago, and we're still concerned about them today. And Lord willing, the Lord is just continuing his work here on earth. But it was fascinating. And disturbing is really the only word I could use for it.
Yeah, I think the reason I wanted you to read it is because I couldn't stop talking about it because, like you said, I think this was written nearly 100 years ago. I think it was the late 1920s or the early 1930s, Aldous Huxley. And like you said, the baby's being incubated, apart from the natural order of a man and a woman, mothers and fathers being completely taken out of the picture and children being raised completely void of a mother and a father. Families being totally a non-thing. Soma. I mean, there are so many things, here we are 100 years later. I'm like, oh, this is like copy and paste what our reality is. But yet it's not, because the good is still fighting against that. Like, I think in these dystopian books, the good is always presented as there's always some good. That's usually why there's a story in 1984 or in Brave New World, is because there's still some good that prevails. But the force for good or Christianity, Bible-believing Christians are still have such a prominent voice in 2025. And that's what gives me hope and optimism, is because we're able to sit here and talk openly about God's design for the family and how that is what he had in mind from the beginning, and it is what's honoring to him, and distortions of that bring destruction and they bring death upon society. And we get to talk about that. Whereas in the settings, usually in these dystopian places, is like you can't even hint at that or whisper at that. And so while you see glimpses of the technology existing now, what we get to speak about and the freedoms that we have as Christians gives me confidence and gives me hope for the future. Yeah.
So anyways.
Oh, it's my turn, just like that.
Right back at you.
Okay. So piggybacking on the Fellowship of the Ring, I got C.R. Wiley's book, The House of Tom Bombadil, or In the House of Tom Bombadil by C.R. Wiley. We had C.R. Wiley on the podcast a couple months, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, after I had read his book, Man of the House, and the Household.
War of the Cosmos?
Yeah, was it The Household and the War for the Cosmos or something like that? Anyways, maybe you said it better. I don't know. I read 2 of his books around manhood and family and just absolutely loved them. Like they inspired me so much. We interviewed him on the podcast and I really enjoyed speaking with him. And then I read In the House at Tom Bombadil after reading Fellowship of the Ring. So it was really fresh off of, reading about Tom Bombadil and passing in Fellowship of the Ring. And I love that C.R. Wiley really used, I feel like, this character to speak to family, to speak to dominion, to speak to marriage, to speak to, I think, some things that he just had such a robust biblical perspective on. And then he was able to use the character of Tom Bombadil and his wife. What's her name? What is her name in the book? Yeah, Goldberry. And their setting in the book to illustrate, I think, what Christians are called to in marriage. This ideal of marriage, this ideal of stewarding God's creation, and in working with nature and creation. I think he actually speaks to stewardship of the earth better than anybody that I've read, right? Because so often when we think of the planet and we think of environmentalism, we think of left-wing wackos, right? People that are like that they think all humans should die for the preservation of the planet. I mean, that's an extreme statement, but that's kind of like at the core of their premise. And yet I think Christians should care deeply about the well-being of our environment and the planet. And I think that he speaks so well to it. And he really he kind of talks about dominion versus dominating in a very, I think, enlightening way. It's very clarifying. And so I could not recommend this book enough. In the House of Tom Bombadil by C.R. Wiley. And really, for that matter, all of his books that I've read anyways. This is only the 3rd of his books that I've read. So Man of the House, the Household and the War for the Cosmos, I think. And then this one, In the House of Tom Bombadil. This one was my favorite, and that's probably just because it was on the heels of reading The Fellowship of the Ring. But I just had so many insights in this. I read through it another almost full time after reading it through one time. Highly recommend this one by C.R. Wiley. Back to you, Katie. Okay, real quick. If you're looking for music lessons for your family, piano lessons, guitar lessons, fiddle lessons, ukulele lessons, mandolin lessons, you can subscribe to Voteberg Music Academy and get lessons for the whole family. Subscribe to the piano course, 1 subscription, get you piano lessons for the whole family. Subscribe to guitar, that gets you guitar lessons for the whole family. We'll link it below. You get a special discount, and you can see that below by listening to our podcast. That's how you get the discount. Go check it out.
I was at home group, and one of my friends was giving back another one of my friends one of the books she borrowed. And I intercepted it and was like, hey, I'll take that. And it was, it was just awesome. A little book triangle here, but it's called Broken Bread, How to Stop Using Food and Fear to Fill Spiritual Hunger. It's by Tilly Dillehay. We also had Tilly Dillehay on the podcast. And after having her on the podcast, I had read her book, Dear Hemlock. And I wanted to get this book, Broken Bread, but it was sold out. And I think it's because she was promoting Dear Hemlock and Broken Bread's out of print. Oh. So if you can snag a copy or, snag your friend's copy, that is the only way you can really get a hold of this book. But it's fantastic. It's all the ways women sin with food. And I've never struggled with an eating disorder per se or something like that. And so I didn't really know how applicable this book would be to me, but everyone I knew was raving about it, and that wasn't necessarily like their personal struggle either. And I just realized, wow, how much I can sin with food and have sinned with food. And she just talks about the asceticism of food, the gluttony of food, and just like the whole spectrum in between. And I really think this is applicable for anyone, not just women, and not just women who would say, hey, yeah, I struggle with food. I think it's just a very applicable book to how we can just all the little pitfalls that we can fall into without trying to when it comes to our health or lack thereof. So anyways, I just really highly recommend this book. And again, if you can get your hands on it, but Tilly is just an incredible writer and is very fun to read, very enlightening to read, and easy to read as well. So
yeah, it is fun how different authors just kind of, they pop in our circles, right? We're in our own little echo chamber, within our friend group and then whatever our online affinities are. And I feel like Tilly Dillehay was one of those authors that was, popping in my family text thread. Cause we interviewed her kind of on her most recent book, Dear Hemlock, which was really enjoyable. She had another one, something,
Seeing Greene.
Yeah. Seeing Greene.
Okay. This is kind of funny because one of my friends for my birthday, she was like, I was going to buy you Seeing Greene, but then I was like, oh, Katie might have already read that book. And I was like, I haven't read it, but on the podcast, Tilly was saying, you can't gift anyone Seeing Greene or they'll take it the wrong way.
Oh, that's funny.
I was like, and you were to gift that to me? Do you think I have a problem with envy? It was kind of funny, just right off the tails of that interview.
Yeah.
I wish I did. I do want to read it though. I still haven't.
Yeah. So I'm really glad we got introduced to Tilly and we were able to talk to her on the podcast, but I also feel like the previous author I mentioned, C.R.R. Wiley, was another one of those because your cousin recommended it to your dad, who recommended it to me. And then just that whole side of the family was just circulating through the C.R.R. Wiley material, really enjoying that. And so, yeah, it makes me grateful for the friend group that we have. And then also for the families that we have that are always, really constantly recommending great literature. Well, I think of also a book that we forgot to mention too. I don't think we brought it here. We had him on the podcast, and that was Dr. Leonard Sachs. And in his book,
The Collapse of Parenting, phenomenal book and phenomenal interview.
Yeah. So once again, just like a family recommendation. It was in the family text thread. We're like, let's check this out, and ended up being such a great read. Anyways, yeah, it was just fun thinking
You're
about
right. I forgot about The Collapse of Parenting, but we read that this last quarter, both of us. And again, we did a whole podcast on it talking to Dr. Sachs. So
Yes.
You guys can check that out. We aren't going to go super in depth into that because I feel like you can go very, very in depth into that book. It's a phenomenal parenting book.
Yes. Well, yeah, and also just so you know, we're actually not going to go through all the books that we read this last quarter because we simply couldn't find all the books that we read this last quarter. We've moved so many times and they've passed hands and they've been moved into different bins. And we were just going through which books we could access and trying to find the books. And like that one, I forgot we had read. Well, and I'll say another one actually that I couldn't find before I say this one. Or no, I'll just say this one.
Well, no, now I'm
just thinking of more books that I read. No. I'll remember it. But the one I was going to bring up next is The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zeihan. I found out about Peter Zeihan. My Uncle Mark actually turned me on to him like right at the beginning of the COVID era there in 2020. And I love talking to my Uncle Mark. He's always thinking and learning and reading interesting things. And he's like, hey, you got to check out this guy, Peter Zeihan. He's broken this down. He knows how this is all going to play out. He's been predicting this for years. And so I started kind of watching some of his YouTube content, and he was starting to make the podcast rounds at that time because he had been speaking about scenarios like this. And then I hadn't read his book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, until just this about a month and a half ago, because I saw it at your dad's house. And it's been really fun to read because Peter Zeihan's like an economist and a geopolitical strategist, and he maps out he goes through a walk through history of how economies have functioned since the beginning of history being documented. And he gets us to modern day where we're in this globalized economy, which is such an anomaly to the history of the world, where, we're able to sit here in our studio and we're using technology. And in this technology, some of it's come from, different parts of it have come from, probably mines in Africa, and then it's been built in different parts of Asia, and then, maybe engineered in Germany first, and then manufactured somewhere else, and then shipped over here to the US. And if you go around just this one room that we're sitting in, it's like there's like multiple continents represented in just what we're consuming, like the technology we're using, the food we're consuming. And that is such a peculiarity to the history of the world. And yet in his prediction, he's like, that's going to come to an end, where that globalization of economy is going to cease, and it's going to become a lot more, localized. And by localized, I mean, country to country, but then also, region to region within those countries. And he breaks down the necessary skill sets and mindsets required to not just survive, but to thrive in those economies. And it's actually a hope-filled book because, and again, similarly to C.R. Wiley's Man of the House book, with that whole premise, his whole premise is like, the end of the world is coming, but don't worry, the end of the world's come before. And people have meaning like there's going to be a collapse, and people have come out for the better throughout these collapses, with the proper mindsets and skill sets and tools. And so I do recommend this book. Peter Zeihan's not a Christian. And so, he's not going to have this eternal perspective on things or a biblical worldview. And he has more of an evolutionary approach to everything that he's referencing here. I like C.R. Wiley's Man of the House book because even though he's talking about the collapse of civilization, he's talking about it from a Christian perspective and how we can approach that as Christians. And so, I do recommend the Peter Zeihan, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, with that caveat being he's not a Christian. And so I don't share his worldview, but it's fun looking at his overview of history and how economies have functioned and civilizations have been established, where we're currently at, how that's going to be based off of all the evidence going to be, I guess, dissipating. That global trade is going to be dissipating. What should we be looking for in our own regional economies and civilizations?
Wow. I feel like I should read that book.
Oh, I think you'll love it.
Especially with like Trump just getting elected. I feel like he's like totally starting that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And he wrote this prior to Trump. He wrote this, I believe, in 2018, or when did he write this? I don't know. He wrote this a few years back. But he's been talking about this stuff for a really long time. And so
I feel like it usually says on the inner cover.
The inner cover?
Like the front inner cover. Like when it's been published.
Well, the opening statement says 2019 was the last great year for the world economy. But I don't think that's when he wrote it. Anyways.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that'll be really interesting. I had to read that. That was great. You sold me.
Yes.
Okay. This book is called, we just talked about the end of the world. Now let's talk about the end of woman. This was a book that was gifted to me for my 30th birthday from a dear friend. How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. Phenomenal book. Like, you cannot put this book down. I'm not one to really read up on things like feminism. I just kind of go, yeah, I don't love it, and move on, with a lot of these things. But this book just captivated me from the very beginning. It's fascinating to hear the roots of feminism, how it applies. Carrie Gress is a great storyteller, and I feel like it's just very, very, very interesting. So anyways, it's like an enjoyable read. It sounds like it's going to be more, I don't know what these like research, and there is so much research in it and stuff like that, but it's a fun read. Like, it's engaging, I guess I should say. So anyways, The End of Woman, I think it's fantastic. And I think a lot of us have, just because of the way culture is, have adopted feminist principles or feminist ideas, or given feminism maybe credit for some things that it got right. And this book just, I think, is really helpful for us to read as Western women. Regardless of what you think about feminism, or regardless of how you think you feel about feminism, I think it would be intriguing to you. So yeah, I recommend it.
I can't remember any of the lines you shared with me from that, but I do remember the time that you were reading that back in January. You would read, and then you'd close, and you'd be like, listen, or you'd be like, listen to this, and you'd read paragraphs to me or sentences to me. I was like, wow, that's so good. But I am with you. It is bizarre how, growing up in a conservative Christian family, I think, was inundated with so many secular feminist mindsets. And I was apologetic about anything regarding patriarchy, right? I was just kind of like, well, yeah, of course, I'm not like one of those Christians. And then you read this, and you read the origin, you're kind of like, wait a second, what am I apologizing for here? What was God's design? What's not God's design? Like, yeah, has there been have men been abusive, and have they shown that, what C.R. Wiley talks about, domination over dominion? Like, that has certainly happened. But you can't say that patriarchy is wrong. Like, this is a God ordained thing in the Bible that he says is a great thing, and that he highlights as being a good thing. And then similarly with feminism, it's like, well, yeah, we're not I don't want to be a feminist, but of course they've got some things right, like what you talked about. And there's so much that we can learn from that. And I like how you approach this, or how this author approached the topic, and just kind of had, especially it being a female author, she's got the ability to do that. Right. It's one thing when a guy's like dismantling feminism, and it's another thing, right? When a woman's dismantling.
That's like, you're the problem.
Yeah,
you're the whole problem.
Exactly. It convicted me to not, I guess, to hold to truth, in regards to all things, to have a holistic and biblically sound worldview on as many issues, on all issues, hopefully, potentially. And of course, I'm going to fall short, but I want to pursue that consistent biblical worldview in every area of life. That all of Christ for all of life. Like I want Christ to be reigning and to have, lordship in how I think about every area of life. And I think things like this or topics like this are areas that I've realized, I've totally just kind of conceded ground to a godless ideology. And so I'm grateful that she wrote on it in the way that she did.
Yeah, I kind of have this pet peeve because this happens in Christian circles where the patriarchy, like this literally just happened in a conversation we were having in the living room. And Elisha threw out, I was talking about chauvinism, like male chauvinism. And you brought up something about the patriarchy. And I knew what he was referencing because what everyone references as the patriarchy now is basically like abusive male domination, like male domination. Maybe it's not abusive, but it's dominating. But I was like, no. Like we can't use that word to mean what people want it to mean in 2025.
Right.
Like the patriarchy was ordained by God. Patriarchs are a scriptural headship.
It's an honorable thing that they're honored.
An honorable position to be in. There are true patriarchs, and we should, as Christians, have a patriarchal society, meaning the man is the head of the household. And so those things are ordained by God. And yes, we have a patriarchy that has been twisted, but we can't let the world win when it comes to these terms. We have to keep the term and be like, no, you mean something different, because the patriarchy is something established by God for our good. What are you talking about?
Yes.
Let's use a different term to describe what you're talking about, which is abusive male leadership.
Yes.
Or whatever the case may be. It's not what God designed. So I'm not going to use this good term to the level that you want it to be degraded to.
Or surrender it to you.
Yeah.
Give up on it. Because
I'm not saying there isn't unhealthy expressions, of male leadership or masculinity. And I get that there is a real discussion around that, but it's not the patriarchy.
Right. Well, and I think, and you called me out on
it. Like,
because I was wrong, because you were trying to explain chauvinism, and I think you were looking for the word chauvinism.
Yeah, I was like, what word is that?
And I was like patriarchal, and you're like, no, that's the problem. Like patriarchal is good. I'm thinking of like something that's not good. Like you're like chauvinism. And I think so often those two are viewed almost as being synonymous. It's like, okay, patriarchs are chauvinists. And that's the battle that I think I've just surrendered to be like, well, you know what? Let's just preach the gospel, or like, let's just tell people about Jesus. But I do think that going back to that all of Christ for all of life, and fighting for truth and standing our ground, it's like, I think we can actually reclaim God's intent for those words and the definition of those words. And it gets me excited to do that. Okay, nice.
You just like blink twice. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mentioned I hadn't read The Lord of the Rings, and I've also not read C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, but I have now started the Space Trilogy. Katie was gifted Out of the Silent, or actually she was gifted the whole Space Trilogy.
I have very good friends.
Yeah. By her friends. And I went ahead and picked off the first book, Out of the Silent Planet. And I can't say that I'm actually not even done with it.
Wait, wasn't Prelandria first?
I think Prelandria is the second one.
Oh.
Yeah.
See, I have not read these yet. Elisha got them and started reading them.
Yeah, I think it's Out of the Silent Planet, Prelandria, or that's how you say it, Prelandria, and then
no, let us know in the comments.
Something hideous strength, or that hideous strength. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to read the whole trilogy because it seems like it's important, and I do really enjoy C.S. Lewis. I will say this: I think I mean, I think I like C.S. Lewis's nonfiction more than his fiction, to tell you the truth. I just absolutely love Mere Christianity. Love like The Weight of Glory, or
The Great Divorce is phenomenal. Screwtape Letters.
Well, I think those are Screwtape Letters would be fiction. And
No,
The
I
Great
thought that
Divorce.
was real. No, I'm kidding.
I do enjoy the Screwtape Letters. I guess I'm speaking primarily like of Narnia, and then of so far the Space Trilogy. To me, it's a little preachy. And I think that because I'm actually reading the simultaneous to J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, where I feel like you get so caught up in the narrative of The Lord of the Rings, it doesn't feel preachy, even though there's a bunch of symbolism and there's a bunch of some kind of allegorical elements that you can draw from it, like C.R.R. Wiley did with Tom Bombadil. I never feel like I'm being preached at with Lord of the Rings. With Narnia, I do feel like it's preachy, and
it's not preachy. It's just a allegory. The style is allegory.
Yeah.
It's not a sermon. It's a written style.
Yeah, and I guess Lord of the Rings is not, and so maybe that's
because it's not a direct allegory,
right?
Which is why.
Well, I don't think
we got into that big discussion about Narnia, Lord of the Rings, and Harry Potter.
That's right. You're right, man. You're right. It was an event.
Are they all
that was
good?
An eventful conversation.
Is Harry Potter different than Lord of the Rings and Narnia? Is Narnia different than Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, exactly.
What should be allowed?
Well, okay, so I don't think
fantasy.
that the Space Trilogy is as allegorical like Narnia is, and yet I still feel like it's a bit preachy. But I'm going to see it through because I know people way smarter than me and that are way, better read than I am, hold these in great esteem. And so I will say that I love C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces, right? Because I felt like that was obscure enough. I felt like you could really get lost. No, I say lost in the narrative. Like you got caught up in the narrative. And so you felt like you were able to draw your own conclusions, for as far as like what was going on ethically and morally. I feel like they don't really, I don't like it when you're not given, it's just preachy, I guess. Like they're like, hey, this is what you're supposed to think from this. But I don't know.
Alex doesn't like to be told what to think.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't put me in a box. You don't talk like that.
No. And obviously there's a time and a place for that. I think I just need to have a different mindset when I'm reading this. I'm sure.
Like if it's God's word, I'll take it. If it's anything short of that, don't preach at me.
Well, no, I do. Obviously, I think the misconception is that some fiction is preaching and some is not. All fiction is preaching something. It's like, how covert is it? Like how are they able to mix, to get that message in there in a palatable way? Because I hear that all the time when people be like, oh, it's so fun reading fill in the blank because you get like this accurate historical context to the day, but it's objective because he's just telling the story. And I'm like, well, no, like every fictional author, I go back to Alexander Dumas, him writing about Mazarin or whatever, the cardinal is, and all those people, that's a historical context that has political ramifications. And that Alexander Dumas, he's got his attitude towards Christianity. He had his attitude towards the Catholic Church. He had his attitude towards I guess France and England and all the nations involved. And so, there's a ton of historical commentary in all of his writings, but it's going to be from his perspective. It's the same thing with like Count of Monte Cristo, right? Like you're thinking, oh, it's just this fun story. But of course, Alexander Dumas is going to have his agenda and how he's laying out history throughout that time period.
It's funny because you mentioned the word commentary, and that just reminded me that this summer it blew my mind that all of the references in my study Bible were someone's opinion on what scriptures went together and what scriptures informed other scriptures. And based on the theological perspective that your Bible was written with, the commentary on the study Bible and the cross references have that theological bent. I know that sounds silly, you guys, but it really threw me for a loop. It's like, I thought that verse, absolutely informed that verse. That's why they were cross-referenced. And then it's like, yeah, at the end of the day, it always comes down to a human's interpretation. And a human's biased opinion will get mixed up in any form of communication. Okay, so I'm going to throw this one out here because it's totally different than anything we've mentioned. It's called The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. And what's funny is my brother and brother-in-law were talking about this book last month. And I was sitting there and I was like, what's this 48 Laws of Power book? And they started like jokingly being like, oh, you shouldn't read that book. Katie shouldn't read the 48 Laws of Power. Like my brother's younger and, you know, he was used to me being his older bossy sister and thought I had enough power already without the power book. And so of course that night I went and ordered it. I was like, who's telling me I can't read what book? I'm going to read it. And I will say this. So this is not written from a Christian perspective, okay? The way that there are a lot of truths in these books, and the way that they are written is like the terms are like exploit so-and-so, or you know what I mean? And so it's not looking out for other people's best interests. I do not like that. There are certain laws of power. It's written by chapter. So each law of power has a chapter. And I'd say there's probably 20 laws that I think are very applicable for just people who would like to relate to other people in a good way.
Yeah, like leadership.
In a leadership role. Yeah. So maybe not power, but a leadership role. Or in a way that, I mean, I do think like, for instance, I think wives have a lot of power over their husbands. If that's used in an appropriate way. So maybe that's not leadership, but it is a way to influence leadership. So maybe I throw that in there. There are the other 20 or 28 laws or whatever, I did not read. So I just went through and was like, hey, this is not what I need to be about as a Christian. There's no point in me reading this. It's not how I want to treat people. It's not how I want to be treated. And I do believe as Christians, we are supposed to surround ourselves. Like, I think of that Philippians 4:8, you know, whatsoever things are true and honest and just and pure and virtuous, think on these things. So I'm not going to dive deeper into like how to exploit your neighbor. Okay. So that said, I have to give that huge disclaimer for this book, but like the first law of power, I think is never outshine the master. Like that is just a phenomenal principle. And the way he explains it is with the stories are just so good and so applicable in life. So there's a lot of very good rules in here, but I mean, I'm going to read one that's like, use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victim. Like, you know, it just sounds like very bloodthirsty. So if you guys read this, you're like, why would she be interested in that? It was kind of like a dare. That's why I was interested in it to start. And then I do think that there's some really healthy things in here when it comes to leadership and influence, but I'd say maybe 50%, maybe less.
Like, I think like a lot of like business books or leadership development books, and really like a secular worldview as they approach things as though it's a zero-sum game. It's like there's got to be a winner and there's got to be a loser. Exactly. And I don't think that like I go back to the, you know, Stephen Covey, another, you know, leadership book or business book, but thinking win-win, you know, and starting with the end in mind or begin with the end in mind. And this, if you have that worldview, or, you know, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, or you know, first shall be last and last shall be first, right? Because the fact is that God's economy is kind of flipped on its head compared to the world. Like the creator of the whole universe, the one that reigns right now, you know, over everything, came down and humbled himself, and he washed the feet of his disciples. And humility and serving and submitting is like, that is the trait of, those are the traits of Christians. And that's what Christ did. First he submitted to the Father, and then he submitted unto death, you know, to bear our sins, and we're called to submit unto him. And so a lot of the laws are just, like you said, come from this worldview that is going to completely be contradictory to God's law, because God's law is, God's ways are not man's ways, you know, and so
they're better. They're so much richer than, you know, you might get some temporary payoff by following this book like a Bible, but it is going to be temporary.
Yeah, because even that first one that you mentioned, the never outshine the master,
Mm-hmm.
when you kind of read some of that section to me, I really saw it as honoring the elder, like honoring our fathers and our mothers, honoring those that have gone on before us, which the Bible does speak to all over in the Proverbs. And then it speaks to it just as an overall theme throughout the Old and the New Testament. And it gives you practical ways to do that in this book. And so he says, never outshine the master. And he tells you why. He's like, you'll get way more out of it if you don't.
Exactly.
And then he gives you these tactics on how to do it. We know we're supposed to honor, I think, our mothers and our fathers, and again, going back to the patriarchs and people that have sacrificed on our behalf, and then you can apply those tactics with that mindset.
Or to your boss or whoever it may be. It's even on a very practical scale. It's not going to be beneficial to know it all in certain positions.
Yes.
I'll read a couple more. Like always say less than necessary. That's proverbial truth. I would say any one of these that it hits the nail on the head is a proverbial truth. He just fleshes it out more. Or number 5, so much depends on reputation. Guard it with your life. That's
a good name is rather be chosen than great riches. Or it's like, you go back to the other one, say as little as possible. It's like, even a fool is counted wise when he holds his tongue. Like all these things are in the Proverbs.
Yes. So anyways, I just think that, if this book, if the way Robert Greene wrote this book was it was all interspersed together, like it was all mixed together, I wouldn't have read it at all. But because it was kind of segmented out, you can kind of pick and choose easier than maybe some other books. So anyways, it was interesting. I think it was honestly pretty good.
Yes.
For chunks of
Yes.
it. But like, would I recommend it? No. I couldn't with a good conscience recommend it, but it led to a lot of interesting discussion between Elisha and I, and it was good.
Yeah. You said it would be interesting. We both read this one, and it's funny because you could speak to it as well, since I will let you speak to this one as well, since you read it too. Okay.
Thank you.
The One Thing by Gary Keller. I read this 5 years ago and was so frustrated. Actually, I didn't finish it the first time. I was so frustrated a few chapters in because I agreed with all the points he was making, but felt completely incapable of simplifying my life in the way he was encouraged, or really saying that you should, like if you wanted to see success, the old proverb, he that chaseth 2 rabbits catcheth neither. That's not like from the Bible. It's an old Chinese proverb. And that's kind of the premise of the book. But when I read this 5 years ago, we were literally trying everything, and we weren't making enough money at one thing to stop the other things. And so I was working 2 jobs. We had 3 businesses.
And we had 4 kids.
We had 4 kids. And also I was still going and doing random gigs with the family. Like we needed to do a lot of things to make ends meet. And so the thought of doing one thing, I agreed with everything he was saying. I was like, if we want to truly thrive and see some success, we need to simplify and focus on one thing. But I just felt incapable of doing it. Reading it this time was so empowering and just struck me as so really, empowering and exhilarating, honestly, because I think we've simplified a lot since 5 years ago. And I think we've got the capability to continue simplifying.
Yeah, it would have taken, like, we were talking about this and we're like, it still would have been faster if we had chosen one thing to grow, say business-wise 5 years ago. Sorry, you guys are probably hearing Lyman quite a bit here, but he's happy to be here. But it was a risk we weren't willing to take. Yes. And like, we've all read those stories. They're very inspirational, where someone goes like $200,000 in debt and like quits their job and puts all their eggs in one basket. And like, we just didn't want to take that stress on. Mm-hmm. So we're like, we're going to continue chasing 5 rabbits. Maybe we won't catch any of them, but we'd rather do that than go all in right now.
Right.
It was just too big of a stress on the family. And I think you do have to know, like, sometimes getting there faster isn't always better.
Well, and also it's like, where are you getting faster? Because now that you say that, we wanted to have children. We wanted you to be able to have time with the children. We didn't want to go into debt. Well, there was a bunch of things that we wanted all at the same time that were because like you said, if we would have quit all the other jobs, lived on a credit card or taken out a personal loan, held off on having kids, and just devoted to one of our businesses 5 years ago, by all means, we would have grown way faster, right? But we wanted to have kids. We didn't want to go into debt. We so therefore we were going to work these extra jobs to keep the cash flow going. And so anyways.
Yeah. So sometimes you just have to realize, like, take what you can and then realize what works for you or what the Lord's calling you to and apply it that way. Margin. We did a whole episode on margin. This book was really influential in our lives, even just this last month. It was huge. And it's funny because in that margin podcast, we talked about potentially quitting some things prematurely to give ourselves margin. And thankfully, just by moving into our barn here, the Lord has just given us a solid chunk of margin just by having a home that's ours. And so we're able to fulfill those commitments. And not that any of you were on the edge of your seat wondering what we were going to do, but I feel like just as a follow-up, we do feel like we are capable of finishing out the things that we committed to. And that's a good feeling. And what we would like to have as our principle, like principally, we would like to finish what we commit to. We think that is important as well, going back to that reputation. And so we're there and we're still like pretty maxed out. It would be nice to have even more margin, but we're going to see these things through and then not commit to more things.
Yes.
So anyways, it was a really encouraging book. I'll just read the little tag here. Restoring emotional, physical, financial, and time reserves to overloaded lives. Nice. So I would highly recommend that one. If you are living in a Western culture, chances are you could use some more margin in your life.
Oh, who doesn't want some more margin? Amen. Cool. Well, let's call it there, Katie, babe.
Sounds good to me.
Thanks for, it's fun to hear about those books you've read.
That was fun. I'm so grateful that we get all these voices in our lives.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Folks, thank you all so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.